but it's such a pleasure to be here. And yes, thank you so much, and thank you for your interest in this campaign. So, my name is Anna Chworow. I'm Deputy Director at Nourish Scotland, and Nourish is a food systems organisation working in Scotland. So we are interested in all aspects, from climate change and sustainability of farming, to food insecurity, to health impact of diets. And public diners is an idea born out of a conversation around Nourish team, when we were trying to think about what is it that makes it easier for people to eat well. In Britain, they run plenty of educational campaigns telling people they should be eating better, but what is it that actually makes it easier for people to eat better? And I remember saying quite flippantly to my colleagues, what makes it easiest for me is if somebody puts a plate of good food in front of me. It removes so many of the barriers. I don't have to plan, shop for, cook a meal, and I don't have to wash up afterwards. So that makes it really easy and convenient. And so we're trying to think about, is there something in that idea that could be done in a systemic way as a form of public infrastructure, and what could the state do to support it? And so we broadly defined public diners as state-supported, affordable restaurants serving healthy, tasty meals to general public, so to everyone, not to any specific group. And we started researching this as a concept, and to our great surprise, we found that in the UK, we had a history of public restaurants or public diners. And this is one of those very hidden aspects of history, but they started in the 1940s. They were introduced during the Second World War by the then Prime Minister, partly in response to the rationing and because the government wanted to ensure that people had access to really nutritious food during that time, but also because women were drafted into jobs and were no longer at home. And so there was a real sense from the government that if women were now part of a workplace, the state needed to do something to support and take over some of the domestic duties that they were previously responsible for. So it was a way of supporting families as a whole during that time. And the picture on the right, you can see here is a picture from London, and you can see really well-dressed people with tablecloths. On the left-hand side, you can see a picture being hung that was a painting on loan from a national collection. So these were places that weren't just canteen-style dining. These were places that were kind of almost cultural institutions and were there to lift people's spirits and allow them to really enjoy the food in nice surroundings. And they had their peak during the war, but actually many of them continued after the war into the 60s. And to give you an idea of how many there were, every major town and city had at least one. London had 100 of them. So they were really part of every neighborhood right across the country. So we were really encouraged by this idea, and we thought, well, if Britain thought of this, have other countries done this? And of course they have. My home country, Poland, does it even to this day. We have 100 subsidized restaurants. They're called milk bars, where the government pays the providers or subsidizes the cost of fruit and vegetables, cereal and milk products. And in turn, there's a regulation in terms of how much those restaurants can charge, which are very low prices. This is one of the examples in Gdańsk, where I'm from. This is the kind of food that's on the menu, really nutritious, lovely home cooking. And to my surprise, I discovered I used to eat in one without even realizing that it was a state subsidized place. I just really loved the food that was there, and it was just really cheap and convenient. So that was a lovely surprise. We have found similar examples in Mexico, where the government sees it as part of delivering on the human rights agenda, including the right to food, which is part of the UN Declaration on Human Rights. So they run 500 of these community kitchens right across the country. We have found an example in Singapore where the government built infrastructure for street food to be made affordable and served in a really pleasant surroundings. We found an example in Turkey where several of the local governments run chains of public restaurants across the country. They started in Istanbul, in the capital, but now are taken up by other local governments because they prove so popular. And the more we talk about the subject, the more we find other examples across the world, including China and Russia and India and lots of other places. So these were some of the history and international examples, and we were really interested in whether people felt that there was a role for public diners in 21st century, because we thought it was a good idea, but the people in the country think it was also a good idea. And last year in February, we convened a conference of over 150 citizens who came together to talk about this concept, discuss it in detail, and really define it to say, when we talk about a public diner, what is it exactly that we talk about? So you can see them here as part of this participatory event. And this was also a meal experience that we put on so that we could really kind of have the experience and then talk about what we felt about the food and the setup and kind of really dive into the detail of it. And out of that work came 7 core principles, which we see as defining the concept of public diners. The first of that is that public diners are state supported. They are part of public infrastructure and a way for the state to take responsibility for making sure the citizens can eat well. In the same way they take responsibility for housing or education or healthcare, we see it as part of that provision. And these restaurants are often underpinned by a state subsidy or an act of parliament or a regulation that kind of is a formal relationship between the government and the providers. There are places that are here today, but also here in a decade. So they're permanent fixtures in a neighborhood or in a community. In the same way that you know where your local library is or where the bus stop is, you know where your local public diner is. And I'm always think very fondly of some of the milk bars in Poland, which have run in the same site for the 50, 60, 70 years, and everybody knows where they are. Public diners are also universal, so they're accessible to everybody on the same terms. They're not targeted at any particular group. They're just there for the whole community to enjoy, much in the same way that a public library is there for everybody, or a public park, or any other part of kind of state infrastructure. Public diners are also places where you want to die. They have nice surroundings, they're pleasant to be in, and they're places where you go and enjoy a good meal. They're affordable. In most of the places we found, the cost is equivalent to a cost of a cup of coffee. So somewhere between 1 to 5 euros, really low prices. And that's deliberate because it's a way for the government is supposed to entice people to come in and enjoy healthy food, which also stops some of the dietary related ill health that can happen if people don't eat well, right? So it's a part of a prevention agenda for the government too. They are places where people can participate in the running of the diners because of the state involvement. They have some form of democratic control, unlike a lot of the privately operated restaurants. This is a really interesting example, for instance, in Singapore, where the stall holders and the local representatives of the community and representatives of the government meet together to discuss how the centers are run. And this came out really strongly also in our own co-production work, is that people wanted these to be places where citizens can participate, not as consumers, but as citizens. And fundamentally, the food, it's tasty, it's healthy enough. We're not aiming for gold standards in nutrition, but we want the food to be as good as what you would cook at home, if not slightly better. And as far as possible, also supporting some of the sustainability agenda around food and making sure the food is both sourced either organically or agroecologically, but also that it really features the vegetables and fruit much more than it does the meat. So these are the core principles that we've been working to, and we're currently running a campaign in Scotland and in the UK as a whole to reimagine and reintroduce these public diners. This is an example of a motion that was put forward in the Scottish Parliament recently in support of them. And we are excited to be talking to politicians about it and having some real interest from all parts of the political spectrum. So I think I'll pause here to allow for any questions you might have, and also to say we have a website and a full report that is available online if anyone is interested.
With so many interesting and also relevant things you mentioned, relevant for the context of Berlin, I'm sure that the audience has some questions. So now is your time. Jetzt ist eure Zeit. Stellt gerne eure Fragen an Anna. Wenn ihr wollt auf Deutsch und ich übersetze, oder ihr macht es direkt auf Englisch, und nicht vergessen, gerne einmal sagen, wer ihr seid und von welcher Organisation ihr kommt. Und seid nicht schüchtern, sie ist gleich weg und dann könnt ihr eure Fragen nicht mehr stellen. Genau, also was fandet ihr besonders spannend? Wo habt ihr vielleicht noch eine Nachfrage? Okay, we have one question, Anna, from Saskia. I'm now introducing you, who will be on the podium later.
Yeah, I didn't want to jump the queue, but as no hands went up. As you're now trying to convince government to help introduce these, did you make some form of costing, or do you have a sort of economic model to back up the plans?
We've done some initial costing, and we think the running of each public diner in the first year is probably around £200,000. But actually, as they become established and as they gain more customers, they become much more economically viable. We don't think they will ever be fully self-sustaining. They will always need a bit of subsidy. But the more popular they become, the more kind of self-sustaining they are.
Wir haben eine Frage aus dem anderen Raum. How high, I don't know from who the question is, because we have now 2 locations because so many people signed up. Thanks for the question. How high is the budget for setting up one location, including building the interior?
Oh, well, so that's a really interesting question. And we haven't really looked at the kind of decoration of the space, which would be, I guess we would be thinking about that as a capital investment, as opposed to just the running and the buying of the food and the staffing cost. But there's also, in Britain at least, many of the local governments own a lot of premises in the cities, and they often own restaurant settings, which they end up renting out to commercial outfits. So we think that if we found kind of a council that was interested, or a local authority that were interested in running of these, they, from within their own stock of properties, could quite easily offer a place on the high street that already belonged to them. So, as part of a kind of public health and public services agenda.
That's a very nice angle, yeah. Yeah, please continue.
Yeah. Just that I think this initial, what we are finding is that the year one is the kind of crunch year in which you need to actually really seriously invest in order to establish them, and to a quality and a standard that attracts lots of customers further down the line. And so keeping going through that first year and probably even into the second year feels really important. And then after that, you can start to see the regulars that are bringing other people in with them, and it's almost like a snowballing effect.
Okay, we have 2 more questions. Yes, here.
Hi, I'm Richard. I'm working for a local NGO, and we do like food hubs and support them in the city. And I would like to ask, in how far does the concept translate into the rural areas? Because we're thinking about diners, and I think it's a rather like urban concept, but in how far can we translate them?
Thank you. That's a great question. We're wrestling with the same question, because in Scotland we have 5 big cities, but actually a lot of the country is very rural. And at the moment, we're concentrating on urban locations because of the footfall and the sheer number of people who are potential customers. It's much more difficult in a remote area. What was interesting in the history of British restaurants is in the war, the rural provision was done by mobile vans. So it was almost like a food truck that went around the country. And so it would turn up to your local village with hot food at 5, 6, 7 o'clock at night so that people could get it in that way. But they weren't sort of established locations. And we think there's also some sensitivity around if you have a very small town and only one viable restaurant, you wouldn't want to bring in more competition that would undermine that restaurant. So yeah, there's definitely some sensitivities there. But I think the mobile van idea at food truck is quite an exciting one.
All right, now one question from the other room again.
Yes. I have a microphone myself now, so I can directly ask you, Anna. How is accessibility guaranteed, or is accessibility guaranteed?
Accessibility, do you mean in terms of finances or physical?
No, in terms of Barrierefreiheit. I need help in the translation here.
Physical accessibility. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I think in Britain at least, there is a lot of regulations around disabled access, and the buildings are getting much better over time. Not all the buildings are accessible fully, but I think it's one of these things where you expect every public building, school, hospital, library, etc., to be fully accessible, and most of them are currently. And I think if these public diners were to get up and running, that would be one of the conditions of operating one. It's not just that the food is good, but that is actually welcoming to everybody, including people who have mobility issues.
I have a question myself as well. During my research, I found out that British restaurants were almost called communal feeding centers until Winston Churchill said, "No way, people. No one is ever going to come to a communal feeding center. We need a new name." So what's your opinion on the importance of a name of such an institution? And do you think public diners is already the right one?
I think it's crucial. I think Winston Churchill was onto something there. We called them public diners, public partly to evoke that sense of public services and link it back to public parks and libraries, etc. And we called them diners because we thought nobody would have any preconceptions. You know, if you call something a community kitchen or a community restaurant, people already can imagine something. But a public diner felt like people would say, "Oh, we don't quite know what that is," and we quite wanted that because we wanted to create this concept together. But I think it's really so it's taken on as a bit of a political campaign. But I think if they were up and running, I think restaurant is quite an exciting name. Some people are thinking about calling them canteens, and that has different connotations in different parts of society too. Some people love the idea of a canteen, others not so much. So I think the branding is everything on this.
All right, last question, because we also have two other very interesting speeches coming up. Do we have another microphone?
Hi, Jan, journalist. I like the concept, but the question I have is, how do you want to avoid competition with ordinary restaurants? Because if you make food even more accessible and affordable, well, there's going to be competition, is it, or is it not?
I think the way we see it is this is a competition to a McDonald's or a competition to a takeaway ready meal from a supermarket, because of the price point partly, but also as a dining experience, it's not quite a treat. It's not the Ritz, it's not a fancy place to go out. From the images you've seen, they're nice places, but they're also not luxury. So it's not the kind of place you would go to celebrate your birthday or anniversary with your partner. And I think in that way, they're quite different from restaurants that you don't go to every day. These are places that you would eat at every day. And so, competition is much more, I think, with a ready meal than it is with an actual restaurant. But also to say that on the grounds of public health, I don't think we should be completely afraid of some degree of competition, particularly with the really low-priced and healthy options from Burger King to McDonald's, etc. I think that is the place where we would want to compete.
All right, thank you so much, Anna.